Welcome to Unpacking the Athlete podcast, hosted by yours truly, Rob Martin. Welcome to Unpacking the Athlete, a podcast dedicated to diving deep into what makes athletes who they are. Today's guest has done a wide variety of cycling, from cyclocross all the way to downhill. Some of his top accomplishments are as follows. In 2012, he was the D2 Collegiate Cyclocross National Champion. In 2015, he was the D2 Collegiate XC and ST Omnium Champion. And in 2022, he was the USA Cycling Downhill National Team Coach. Our guest today is Cory Rimmer. Welcome, Cory. I can't wait to learn how you went from cyclocross to enduro and downhill.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here, Rob.
Glad you could be here. First question, I think I mentioned it's off the wall, and I'm going to hit you with it right away.
All right.
If you had to pick between these three bikes to attempt a downhill course on, which bike would you choose and why? The first bike is a road bike with wide road tires and has a suspension fork and shock. The second is a fully rigid mountain bike with whatever tires you want. The third is a fat bike with 4.5-inch jumbo gym tires.
Oh, I'd take the rigid mountain bike. Yeah, for sure.
And what tires would you throw on there?
At that point, it almost wouldn't matter. Just anything with knobs, really. Knobs and very tough casing. Yeah, the road bike, definitely the geometry wouldn't be in your favor. The fat bike, I feel like there'd be too much squirm in the tires and would make it feel pretty squirrely. I think if the mountain bike had decent enough geometry, you could just go slow and really wouldn't need too much suspension.
That's kind of what I was going to pick as well, just because the road bike, I think if you just, even with suspension, if you hit anything, you'd go over the bars.
Yeah. It's funny though. I did, when I did a lot of road riding for training and stuff, I mainly did it on cross bike with slicks, and I loved riding it on single track. It was just something about taking a bike where it's not supposed to be was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I've got a bike that I use for cyclocross, road, and gravel, and I'll take that on single track sometimes, and it's kind of fun because it's different. It's totally different.
Yeah, like in the motorcycle world, they say riding a slow bike fast is more fun than a fast bike slow.
Yeah,
It's kind of the same concept.
Yeah. What would you do if you weren't involved with cycling and mountain biking for a career? What do you think you'd be doing?
That would be tough. I thought about that myself sometimes and still haven't come up with an answer. I've been in the cycling world since I was like 13 or 14, and it's kind of all I ever knew. And every decision I ever made was based around the cycling world. I've had construction jobs doing trim carpentry. I've done all kinds of weird stuff like that. I would imagine I went to a summer camp as a participant, and they were kind of leading me into like becoming a counselor type role. And before I was able to have the opportunity to do that, they closed down. And that was something I really enjoyed. And it's kind of something I found now, but through cycling with all the coaching, but probably something in that realm, some kind of coaching thing. It just something I seem to mesh. It seems to come a little easy for me. It's not easy, but it's all the things that I've gotten into have always been difficult for me besides this. At least that's how it feels.
Well, it sounds like you found your niche. For
Yeah.
sure. Since you're involved in bikes, can you explain what you did last year with the downhill team as a coach?
Every year there's mountain bike worlds, and since COVID 2020, there's been a hiatus for a coach for the downhill team side of worlds. At worlds, they have XC and downhill usually at the same venue at the same time. And so XC will have their coach, and then downhill has their coach, and then they have Swaniers and things like this. And this is all run through USA Cycling. And last year, Jesse Anthony, who was in charge of team selection and a lot of the logistics for that program, had reached out and asked if I was interested. I said I would be. He had kind of got my contact through some of the athletes that are participants of that team. And then once they decided that they wanted to fill the role, they asked me if I would do it. I said, yep. Once there, it's a lot different than what I normally do. I'm normally working with the same athletes a lot through my team, and with this program, it was all new athletes, and a lot of it's not necessarily me coming in and changing their program, especially for such a big race like Worlds. It's more me just making sure they have everything that they need and letting them know that I am a resource if they want it there. Even though some of them I just met, right? I haven't established any kind of coach athlete relationship with. I was a little worried that I wasn't going to be effective, but whether they're lying to me or not, they said I helped them. So it was a great learning experience for me, and I hope to do it again.
That sounds like a fun experience for sure.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. I'd been working with my own athletes in Europe at other World Cups, and so to be able to go to the World Champs was like kind of a big accomplishment for me. And to be able to help that level of athletes was pretty rewarding.
So you're coaching a lot. Do
Mhm.
you I think you still do ride and race the bike. And what do you like to race, and what is your favorite bike right now?
I've taken a lot of very many steps back from racing, especially kind of compared to where I used to be. I tell people all the time, like, imagine yourself being an F1 driver, and then all of a sudden you have to race Honda Civics. That's how it feels when I race. It's just not quite the same when you're not constantly training and preparing yourself. Right now, enduros are a lot of fun just because it's a laid back vibe. You get multiple opportunity or stages to put down a race run. Downhill's like one and done. Your whole weekend preps around one run, and you mess it up and your whole weekend's kind of ruined. Cross country, yeah, I miss it. I definitely miss it a lot, but not being able to train like I used to, it's just not it's not appealing when to me when you're not kind of going in where you need to be or where you were. I know a lot of people who kind of retire from a professional career and can still race recreationally or in a retired state and really enjoy it, but I have a hard time doing that. I'm not there yet. I think someday I will be. I'm just not there yet. I like doing everything, but yeah, I would say I'll probably only race like 2 or 3 times a year now.
Okay. What's your bike of choice for an enduro race? What do you ride?
Currently an e-bike. I ride the e-bike a lot. Because a lot of these enduros are super long, like they're 4 or 5 hour days on the bike, and so e-bike just makes it quick and easy. And two, I'm still catering to my riders when I'm out there racing. I'm not just there for myself. And so being able to zip up and down and checking in on everybody and running back to the pits, it's a lot more riding than what a normal racer would do. And so e-bike's a lot of fun. And then if it wasn't an e-bike, I have a Kona Process X that I really like. That's a lot of fun. And then some of the local enduros, I would actually race my XC bike just because the tracks weren't quite as technical or anything like that. So the XC bike was a lot of fun to race, especially if it had decent geometry.
Yeah, and it's a little lighter, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's easier on the body. Some of the enduro bikes when I was doing like EWS, like continental races a few years ago. I mean, you're on a 35-pound bike for 6 hours in the day, and it's a slog.
Yeah, that'll end up getting you, won't it?
Yeah, yeah, big day.
Throughout your career with all your different disciplines, what discipline do you like the most?
Oh man, that one's super tough. No one's really asked me that before. I can't say that I have a favorite. Like cyclocross and XC always has a special place in my heart because I had the most success there. It's just tough because for me, I feel like that's something you really have to prepare for. Whereas, like, kind of enduro, I feel like anybody can do it. The tracks, especially like local enduros, the tracks aren't really that technical. Sometimes XC descents you'd find on an XC course is the same, that you're racing for an enduro. I would say if I were to recommend a first type of racing for someone, it would be enduro, just because it's the most approachable. Everyone's like super laid back and chill. You get done with a stage, you wait for your buddies to finish, or they're waiting on you, and you tell your war stories of what happened during the stage as you're pedaling to the next one. The vibe's really good, and I think sometimes racing can be intimidating for recreational riders, and I think enduro is probably the most welcoming community. Not that any other discipline isn't. I would just say enduro is the most. Downhill is just really intimidating, just because of the nature of the tracks and things like that. But the people are super nice. Cyclocross would probably be my next. Okay, if like gravity oriented racing isn't your thing, I think cyclocross is a lot of fun. It's you usually don't have to drive too far for a race because they're at city parks and things like that. I would easily, say if my daughter wanted to go do a race, I would probably like, oh, let's go do a cyclocross race because I know she would enjoy it and not be too overwhelmed.
Yeah. And usually at cyclocross races for kids and the beginners, they have some pretty cool prizes like 6 packs of pop or
Yeah, yeah. The prizes are always super interesting at cross races because it's always like a local shop putting it on, and especially the small races are awesome because you're just getting like such random stuff. So
yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I've always enjoyed that community just because it's always been super friendly and people are super passionate in the cyclocross world. That's one
Yeah.
thing I got to say is there's not probably a more passionate discipline of cycling than cyclocross.
I'll agree. I think cycling as a whole is a pretty good community.
Hmm.
You talked about all those different disciplines, and I haven't done them all, but I've been and experienced them all. I mean, I've done cyclocross and cross country, and I've been to enduro and downhill races. And the I think you're right with the downhill. That one is the most, to me, it's the most daunting, especially if
Hmm.
you. I mean, I've been to the World Cup at Snowshoe every since when I think 2019 was the first time I
Yeah,
went, and I went the last 2 years as well. And after the race is done, I like to wait until the sweeper comes down and then make sure it's okay with the track officials that the track's clear, and then walk up the track so you can
yeah,
see the absolute craziness that they're riding down. And
yeah.
yeah, I wouldn't recommend downhill for your first cycling event.
Yeah, yeah. That track is Snowshoe is, it's a newer venue compared to a lot of other tracks on the circuit. And it's some of the racers' favorite and some of the racers' least favorite. On a gradient level, Snowshoe is considered a flatter track. You make a mistake, it's hard to build the speed back up. The rocks are always so slick when it's muddy there. There's not much anything else slicker. It's probably one of the first tracks that I've seen that makes some of the professionals look human, not like it's pretty wild. So that's super cool. And I'm so happy that America gets, a World Cup round like that to kind of showcase all those athletes.
Me as well. I'm happy to go watch, and I'm happy that it's here. Speaking of enduro, I've never done an enduro race, but I've thought about it. So you talking about it just now makes me want to look up some local enduro races and maybe try those, because I'm just, I think I could do pretty good. Because, like you said, some cross country courses have some gnarly downhill sections and
Yeah.
some gnarly
Yeah.
features. So,
Yeah, for sure. And thinking about what a lot of those guys are riding now, like a lot of national tracks and World Cup XC tracks, they're adding more and more technical features to be more spectator friendly. And you're even seeing, bikes get designed around that. I notice a lot of the SRAM RockShox athletes aren't running the 32 mil stanchion SID, they're running the 35 mil stanchion SID. So they're sacrificing weight over performance because of the technicality of the tracks. And so I would say you'd be really surprised. A lot of these XC riders like Christopher Blevins go out and do an enduro. I think he would do super well, like
yeah, yeah.
there's some seriously talented descenders in the XC world.
He's definitely one of them that I would pick. He's got some great technical bike handling skills for sure. I know my old giant Anthem, I think, had 90 mils of travel, and I think the new one's up to 110,
Yeah.
so it's like you said, it's different because the courses are definitely getting harder, and you have to have a little more give, I think, to make it through the course smoother. So
Yeah, I think Nino, the whole Scott team's on 120 bikes now. So,
yeah,
yeah, so I mean, it's wild. Back in the day, I remember like Adam Craig when he was racing for Giant at World Cups, he ran a 120 mil fork and he was telling people not to do it, because he was like, oh, you have to run 100. I'm just doing it because that's what I prefer, but that's not what I think is the absolute fastest for everybody. And so now people are running 120 front and rear. So,
yeah, it's definitely changing. Thinking about last season as a coach, what was the hardest and most challenging race for an athlete of yours or as a team, and why?
last year, I had two athletes of mine tackle several of the World Cup rounds, and we went over early to Austria to do what's called an IXS Cup. It's kind of like a European national series. We went over there, and these two guys are, easily top 10 in the country. And, with the right ride, they would, be top five at any national event. And they go over, and I remember our first race, it was an IXX Cup. It wasn't even a World Cup. And it also happened to be the Austrian Nationals. And they go up for qualifying to see where they're going to start for the final. And they come down. They tell me they had, pretty good run. They felt really good about it, pretty clean, not too many mistakes. And I remember we kind of checked the results and they were mid pack. And it was a big shell shock, like I could just see it, like their demeanor change, and realize like, oh crap, like this isn't as easy as it was back home. And so as a coach, you got to figure out like how to keep, and downhill confidence is huge, like everyone has really good skills, but whether you believe in yourself or not, Matt, is the difference between pulling the brakes going into a corner and not pulling the brakes going into a corner to keep their morale up and things like that. And it's just me because we go over there and I know nobody, they know nobody, nobody's there to tell them that it's going to be okay. And so that's the toughest part as a coach, is handling the mental side of athletes, I think, and getting them to believe in themselves when they feel like no one else is, including themselves. And it's hard for me too because I want them to do extremely well. I'm disappointed as well, not necessarily that they did anything wrong, but it's like, I want them to do super well also. So, and I have a hard time not wearing my emotions on my sleeve. And so that's something, I have to do better at as a coach as well. And not ignoring the situation. What happened, but how do we move on? How do we improve? And
Yeah,
I think keep looking forward is probably the key for a lot of athletes.
I agree with everything you said there. I coach over here young kids, all the way from sometimes elementary up to high school, college, and I think you're right. The head game is the biggest game because you can get them ready, but there's
Yeah.
always the head game. So I think that's the toughest as a coach as well,
Yeah.
especially after a bad performance. You gotta get them back to a good mindset after a bad performance, and everyone's gonna have a bad performance every now and then. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's super tough and letting them realize that there's good days ahead, Last year at Nationals, one of my XC riders goes out, at Nationals for cross country and just implodes. Didn't even do even remotely well for what they're capable of, and came through, really depressed, like, all the hard work I've done hasn't worked. I told him, I was like, "Hey man, like there's tomorrow. There's all, we still have short track left, like, our bodies are capable of amazing things, just flipping a switch, and sure enough, the same thing happened. He ended up with the sixth place in short track and turned the whole trip around. And so it's just crazy how the body works, right? And I think a lot of it for the XC race was nerves and having extremely high expectations of what they're wanting to achieve. And I think, when it doesn't come easy, we tend to shut down. And then once we have nothing to lose, we do super well.
exactly. Good points. At this point in your life, would you rather, and I think I already know what you're going to say based on what you've already said, would you rather race your bike, chase a good KOM, or go ride some epic stuff with friends? And what's the
Ah,
reason?
yeah. Man, Definitely, that's tough because when I got into cycling, I immediately got into racing. And so every ride had a purpose. I'm either recovering, working on skills, threshold, VO2 max, zone two, whatever. And as I've stepped away from racing, I really struggle. Like now when I ride, I'm giving lessons, I'm coaching, I'm working with somebody. It's so rare that I just go ride with friends for fun. And it's kind of hard for me to do that because I'm like, what's the purpose of this? Why am I even doing this? And so it's like my brain is like really wired into like having a purpose for a ride, and fun isn't one of those listed. But I'm getting better. When I find the time, yeah, I would totally go ride with friends. Definitely.
Well, I think you should probably add more of those to your fun.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know. I need a coach that literally all they tell me is to go have fun.
Go have fun, man.
Yeah.
Go have fun
Yeah.
today. Get
Yeah,
out with
my
your
my
friends,
fun accountability coach.
right? Oh, okay. We're going to shift gears and we're going to go back a little bit and maybe talk about where you grew up, what school you went to, maybe if you went off to college, where'd you go?
I grew up like in the Knoxville, Tennessee area, specifically a place called Friendsville, and it's just out in the middle of nowhere. A lot of farm road. It's in the Tennessee Valley. I'm about from Friendsville is probably about 30-minute drive to the Smoky Mountains. And I went same high school, middle school, all throughout. Played soccer up till middle school, for all the way from 4. And then about middle school is when I started getting into riding. And by then, I was going into my freshman year of high school, and then I got on to the cross country and track team. So I was doing soccer, riding, and cross country and track, and then it was just too much. And so I was like, I like riding the most. So I was like, what benefits me more, XC and track for riding or soccer for riding? And I pick XC and track. And so did that all through high school. And then until my senior year, I didn't run cross country or track so I could focus more on my riding. And that kind of like just wrapped up my junior years. And then college, straight out of high school, I went to Brevard College in North Carolina. Went there fall of '09, spring of 2010. And I learned probably more about myself that year than anything else. I was a very immature individual, and, quickly realized like I had a lot of success like on the cycling team, but academically, no. I just wasn't disciplined enough to not go and do a 5-hour ride in Pisgah versus like go to class and things like that. So after Brevard, I stayed there over the summer just working and riding. And then in the fall, I moved back home and decided like, I'm just going to work and race. So got a job doing trim carpentry with a friend of mine so I could afford to go race and things like that. And I did that for a little while, and it was pretty awful. Like the construction world is not for everybody, including me. It's like hard, and it's hard to take care of yourself in that environment, but it made me quickly realize like I either got to make cycling work or I got to go get something going, because you make a lot of money quick, and so it's easy to get trapped there. My girlfriend at the time, or well, my wife and was my girlfriend at the time, was like, "Hey, let's go back to school." She was going to Virginia Intermont College in Bristol, Virginia, and they had offered me a really big cycling scholarship. And I was pumped. I was like, all right, I got an affordable way to go to school now. That's where I won cyclocross nationals. And then so went there for 2 years, and then the school shut down due to financial reasons. They didn't tell us until I think it was like April or May, like basically right before the semester ended. And that put us in a bad spot because I remember I was talking to several collegiate teams, like saying, "Hey, my school shut down. Like, what are the opportunities with your program?" And they're like, "We're sorry, we've already allocated all of our scholarship money. There's nothing really we can do." And I just came off, winning a collegiate national championship. So it was a really tough spot. But luckily, King University, which is on the other state line side of Bristol in Tennessee, Basically, what they did was they just created a grant to match my cycling scholarship. They called it like the Virginia Intermont Completion Grant or something like that. And so transferred to King, and then that's where I won the XC National Short Track and Omnium for them, and finished out my collegiate career there and graduated with a degree in finance.
That's quite the path there.
Yeah, it was a lot. It was way too long. Had I been smarter and could you know prioritize a little bit better, I could have got it done shorter. But it's just not how it went. Is what it is, and I'm glad for it.
Had some trials and tribulations in there to make you a little, I don't know, more durable, I guess, throughout life.
Yeah, yeah. It made me very frugal. I was like, when I was going to King, like I had this apartment in my senior year. It was 2015. I was 25. My wife had graduated and she was working at University of Virginia at Wise, and we became pregnant. And so it was like, my senior year, she was living in the dorms over at the college. And so I was like, oh man, like everything got real. So that is about the time I started making the kind of doing more coaching and things like that. So it was scary, but it all worked out like really, really well.
Did anyone influence you to get on the bike? Did you look up to anyone?
Oh, totally. The area where I lived, like the fastest way, it was like just before like everyone had cell phones, right? And so I was riding my bike to go see my friends. We lived near a large lake, and so there was a lot of TVA who would own the lakes, or the utility companies also owned land along the lakes. And so we had a lot of trails there. And then one day we were riding and we found these trails on this property. And so we were just riding around, and all of a sudden this guy just comes tearing through the woods on his bike. And I was like, we're so screwed. We just got caught riding on this guy's property. And he was like so pumped to see kids just riding his trails. He was from Long Island, New York. He talked to, a million miles an hour and was just like full gas all the time. And he took me to my first race. He lived in our neighborhood. So he was like, you guys got to, come to this race. And so he took me to my first race, and I just never looked back. He kind of introduced me into the world of riding. My parents, weren't bike riders, but they supported me fully with it. My dad took me to all of my races and things like that after that. And, but yeah, it was, Jeff Went was the man I ran into in the woods. Him and his wife rode, and they took me to my first race and just kind of showed me the ropes, and the rest is history.
That's crazy. Do you remember
Yeah.
what was that, like middle school area time frame, or yeah?
Yeah, I think I was like 13 or 14 years old.
Okay. That's cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was pretty wild. I don't know if I hadn't ran into him. I don't know if I'd have been into it or not. I don't know. I don't know
Right?
if I'd have found it.
That's cool. And so obviously cross country and track helped keep you and made you faster, obviously on the bike, probably for cardiovascular reasons.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I picked it. I wasn't like I'm not a genetically gifted athlete. And track, what's funny is track and cross country made me realize that, because we're all doing the same exact workouts, on the team. And we had a good coach, that kind of knew what he was doing too. So, and then it was apparent that it came easier for others, and it wasn't the easiest for me. So I just was having more success on the bike, just, maybe because there was less people doing it, or because there's a skills factor to it, whatever. But I just was more passionate about that, and kind of did cross country and track because of the fitness benefits. And, that was what my friends were doing. So,
Yeah. Do you remember when and where your first ever race was? And can you walk us through that experience?
yeah. So it's called the I Cycle, and it's kind of like a mini little mountain bike festival in Fontana, North Carolina. And I remember they only had 3 categories, like beginner, sport, and open. There was no like junior categories or whatever. And I think I was like 13. I think I was 14 by that time. and they did a Le Mans start. So you had to lay your bikes on the ground, and we were all lined up, and we had to run to our bikes. And I'm like next to these like grown men, in the beginner category. And I guess because I'd been, doing a lot of running then, I got to my bike real quick. And I remember I was like third into the woods. We dropped into the single track and we had to climb up. And it was a steep bench cut. So if you fell off the side, you're gonna have to kind of scramble back up. Well, that's exactly what I did. I like fell over, but my bike was like still laying in the trail. And I remember these like adult men like yelling at me to like get up and go because there was these guys getting away, and my buddy was doing it with me, and we were like kind of on this adventure together. We only raced like the start and the finish. The rest of it was just like figuring out how to survive. Because it was like very like Pisgah-esque type trails, like very rocky, machine built stuff. Really wasn't a thing yet then. It was so funny. It was so hard. I remember it being so hard.
I can totally hear the older guys just get out of the way. Come on, we're coming up. Get on your
Yeah,
bike. You're holding
yeah,
up the line.
yeah. I was like kind of shell shocked. I was like, they're not as friendly as they were on the line. Like, it kind of made me wish I didn't start as well as I did. But and
Right.
I don't even remember what place I got. I think we were like in the teens. It wasn't like those stories you hear like, oh, I won my first race. I was like, no, I wasn't even top 10.
Let's talk about that CX race in 2012. And can you take us back to that and walk us through it?
Yeah, so that was when Cyclocross Nationals was in Madison, Wisconsin. It had been a few years since I'd raced collegiate in Brevard, so I was racing for Virginia Intermont. Our cyclocross scene for that collegiate year wasn't that big in the Southeast. And so I knew I was doing really well in my conference, in the Southeast Conference. So I didn't really know what to expect going to Madison. I remember that year they were having a lot of trouble with the track thawing. It'd get really muddy. And so these bad ruts would form and then it would freeze. And the ruts would be, these frozen deep ruts that were really, really difficult to ride because they didn't move. When the ruts are muddy, they kind of move with you if you start to get off balance, kind of like riding in the sand. But these ruts didn't move. And I remember before our race, they took a skid steer and we're going to try to scrape up the ruts. But what ended up happening is the dirt just kind of broke up into these icy chunks and it's kind of just made it like gravel almost, this weird, like thick gravel, but it was clumps of frozen mud. And I remember being super cold. We'd go and pre-ride, pressure wash the bikes, and if you didn't store them inside, they'd be frozen the next day. They wouldn't shift, they wouldn't break, like they would just roll. And so I remember we'd always having to keep them in the hotel. But the morning of the race, it was like 12 degrees, I think. It was the coldest I've ever ridden in. Like just doesn't do that in the South very often. And I don't know. I was super focused that year. I remember I went to a bike shop in town, got some spikes for my shoes, and then I asked if they would grind like a point to them because they were rounded off. And I knew if I had a point, because I remember the barriers were on uphill and people were struggling with running traction. And so I was like, if you can put a point on them, I knew I could run. So we started. I think I got the whole shot. And I remember it was me and I think Casey Hildebrandt from Wisconsin. We were kind of off the front. I remember I got these new shoes. And they had boa, and the boa popped out, not like off, but like disengaged. And I remember my shoe almost coming off, and I had to like stop and twist it. And I was just like, man, this is not going well. And then I don't know. I just settled into a pace. I'm not a punchy rider. I guess, I would say what's a lot of people refer as to a diesel. I never really had high watts, but I could, finish the race with a higher average of watts, I guess. And so that's just what I did. I just kind of put my head down and focused. And I remember I built a pretty decent lead going into the last lap. And I remember like going into the last lap, I was like, don't mess this up. Don't flat. Don't do this. I think I was so nervous about messing it up. I just rode worse. Like I think my last lap was one of my slowest laps. And then, yeah, I was able to just roll in uncontested. And that was that.
That's solid for sure, especially with conditions that you hadn't been used to, cold air and whatever frozen mud pebbles were everywhere on the
Yeah,
ground.
yeah, it was definitely weird, but I enjoyed the technical side of cyclocross. That was definitely my shining point. If it was a flatter track, a field crit per se, I never did quite as well unless, it had a lot of off-camber and technicality to it. So the fact that it kind of spiced things up a bit was in my favor.
Can you explain to everyone what XC is and what ST?
Cross country, now they call it XCO, like an Olympic format. Cross country nowadays is, say, a lap of 2 to 5 miles, and you do multiple laps. The race will kind of be set per se, like, okay, we're going to do 5 laps, and that's cross country. A little bit longer track, longer race times for pros. It's anywhere between an hour, hour and a half. Juniors could be, or 45 minutes to hour 15 minutes, like depending on, what the promoter wants to do. It's basically first one to finish wins, right? First one to complete the laps wins. Short track is going to be, the track could be like a kilometer long or about a mile long, much, much faster lap times. XC lap times could be in the 10 to 15 minute range. Short track's going to be in the 3 to 5 minute range. And what they usually do for short track is say, okay, we're going to race 20 minutes plus 2 laps. And once the riders come through 2 or 3 laps, they basically kind of calculate how many laps they're going to do in 20 minutes. And then after a while on the start line, you'll see a lap countdown: 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's a much higher intensity pace since you're only doing 20 minutes plus 2 laps. So you never really race more than, say 25 minutes. It's a lot more spectator friendly because the tracks are a lot shorter. They sometimes, they do cool things like go through the pit or go through the spectating area. It's a lot more fun to watch because the racing's a lot tighter, right? If you have an extremely fit athlete, they don't have as much time to wear out the not as fit athlete. And so it can be more entertaining to watch in that aspect. Whereas cross country, generally by the last lap, it's pretty settled, unless you got 2 riders together or something like that. But short track, it's like 10 riders are together. So much higher intensity, a lot more fun to watch usually. But yeah, that's kind of the biggest differences there.
So in 2015, was it set up where you did short track first and then XC, or was it the opposite way?
Yeah, we did short track first. And, short track wasn't, I'd say, my strongest. Like I said, I never really had that like top end power. I could just set a good pace and just hold. And then I would just have to hope that pace was higher than everybody else's for short track. And I remember that short track, I wasn't feeling like 100%. I don't think had quite gotten my legs opened up yet. And I remember my teammate was doing really, really well. And there was 3 of us, me, my teammate who was Kyle, and then there was a rider. I forget what school he's from. His name was Ben. And I remember my teammate, like 10 minutes left in the race, kind of went off the front, and, it kind of like crit tactics, right? If your teammate goes up the road, you just kind of sit in, and that's what he did. He went off, and I was like, I had won a lot of races by then, but I was like completely content. Like, if he's going to go for that, I'm going to let him do it. Ben was chasing and I was just sitting. And then I remember one lap, it was the second to last lap. I thought for sure Kyle had it. And then we come around the corner to start the second to last lap, and he's on the side of the trail putting his chain back on his bike. His chain had fallen off, and then and then I go from like, okay, like Kyle's gonna win this, to like, crap, now what do I gotta do to win? And it just came down to a sprint finish, and luckily it was an uphill sprint, because it had been flat, I think Ben could have got me, but since it was an uphill, I guess my watts per kilogram were in my favor. So yeah, sprinted and won that, and then I think next day we had XC.
And how did the XC race go?
XC was good. I remember the start wasn't my favorite. I like kind of short starts that go directly into single track, but this start had a long double track, probably like a 2 mile section of double track before you got to the single track. And that just allows a lot of people to be near the front. and it's a lot of jockeying for pace. And so the pace is really, really high. It's kind of like doing a sprint finish in a road race, right? You're trying to do the lead out and you're trying to stay near the front for the sprint, but the sprint's into the single track. And though that really high intensity pace wasn't my favorite, I like to just kind of like, set a pace and go. And so that was a struggle, but I was able to hold on and I was able to get into the single track first. And that collegiate nationals was in snowshoe, and their single track is very, very technical, which was in my favor. So I knew I really wanted to get into the single track first. And once I did that, I was able to ride really well. And I remember once you got into the single track, it was a descent. You descended all the way down to that little, it's on the opposite side of the downhill World Cup, but you descend down to a lake and you go around the lake and you climb back up a flow trail. I wanted to use the single track to get out of sight, whether I was, 30 seconds in front or 30 minutes in front. I just knew I wanted to be out of sight to kind of, psychologically let them think the race is over. And so I took a lot of risk in the downhill. So, and then, set a good tempo on the climb. I looked back and I couldn't see them. So I knew I could just kind of set a good tempo. I didn't have to like kill myself. And then, was able to kind of just stay off the front for the rest of the race and just nurse the bike in.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're back at snowshoe, so I'm thinking about the slippery rock again on the downhill section.
Yeah. It was a lot of roots, a lot of rock. That place is it's super cool because the ecosystem is a lot different than a lot of, especially in the South. I think snowshoes around 4,000 feet altitude. So the ecosystem is a little different. There's a lot of moss, a lot of roots, a lot of like fern and pine, whereas the South, the woolly adelgin has kind of killed all our hemlocks and pine. But
yeah.
It's super unique tracks up there.
It is. And when he says roots, they're roots. And if there's any water,
Yeah.
they're really slippery. And I don't know, it gets sketchy. I remember, I think it's called, is it 6,000 steps or something? There's a little, okay, is that what it's called?
Yeah, it kind of looks like a creek bed.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the first year, or was it? Yeah, the first year I went there, it actually was dry. There wasn't rain, everything was dry, and I had my XC bike, and I did 6,000 steps, and I just ripped down it on my XC bike. And then I went back, not last year, but the year before, with a buddy, and I brought my enduro bike. And I was like, I'm gonna crush 6,000 steps. I'm gonna try to get in the top 10 of the Strava segment. And it had a little bit of rain, and I could not keep the bike straight on the routes. It kept sending me to the right or left, and I think my time was like 5 minutes slower on that bike when I thought I was going to be like 2-3 minutes faster.
Yeah.
So conditions there can change fast and can make the track totally different. It was crazy. Yeah,
man. That place produces like some amazing riders. I got 3 girls on my team that race downhill and cross country, and they're so good technically, just because that's kind of where they grew up riding, was in and around snowshoe and growing up in West Virginia. And that's just what they know. There's not really that much flow trail opportunity over there. And so it's amazing what that place has been able to produce as far as riders.
Yeah. If you go off and ride away from the resort, all the trails are just it seems like it's non-stop technical. There's no flat. There's no smooth. So, yeah.
I'm a pretty big advocate of like you become a product of your environment. It's a shame that place is out in the middle of nowhere. It's so hard to get to, so.
Yeah, seriously, it is.
Yeah. It's so far. Like you get off the interstate and you're like, oh man, we're about there. And it's like 2.5 hours.
And I think that's why they had thought about moving the event, because it's, athletes can't just fly there. You gotta drive in, man.
Yeah. And just like the whole production of it. I think with Discovery taking over, it's supposed to be an even bigger production, more cameras, more equipment and things like that. So it'll be pretty interesting because, it was already a pretty tight show up there as far as space. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all goes.
I agree. How did you transition from winning national championships in cross country and cyclocross to doing enduro and downhill? How did those come into the picture?
Around 2015, when my wife and I got pregnant, that was the year I won nationals at snowshoe for XC. My training style, I responded really well off volume. I could just crush out 20-hour weeks and then just kind of taper off. And then I would have these great peaks, and being in school, having a kid, that training just didn't work, right? I can't go out and do that volume. I can't just go out and knock out 6-hour rides, anymore and things like that. And so I knew that I didn't have the organizational skills and things like that to be a dad, a student, and an athlete. I kind of was like, okay, what else can I do? And I was like, oh, I'll try out enduro. Enduro was, kind of the up and coming new thing. It was the gravel of the time. So I went out, did my first enduro race and did pretty well. And I was like, okay, like I think I got fourth or something like that. And I was like, all right, man, this is awesome. Like I had decent enough skills and I had plenty enough fitness. So I was like, I'll do more of these. So I started doing more of those. And then in 2016, Windrock Bike Park opened. At the time, I was living in Maryville, Tennessee, and that's like a 50-minute drive to Windrock. And so Sean Leader, which was one of the guys that co-owned the bike park at the time, I knew him from his cross country days. He had just opened it, and so he let me come out and ride, and so I started riding there a bunch, and it was crazy. I was like, in an XC helmet, no knee pads, like, at this downhill park, like risking life and limb, and everyone's just like, who is this guy? The downhill culture was like super nice and awesome, and so did more enduro stuff there. And about at the same time, I started coaching, skills coaching, and I got contracted. I went out and got certified through PIMBIA, Professional Mountain Biker Instructor Association, and then got hired by a company called Ninja Mountain Bike Performance. Basically, what they do is they do skills clinics all over the country and then contract coaches to run the clinics for them. Started doing that and then started riding more at the bike park, started kind of coaching people at the bike park. And then that's kind of how that transition happened. It just kind of happened organically. And then the sad time of like, okay, I'm not going to be an XC racer or anything like that. That was tough. I was like, when am I not going to be a racer anymore? Because that was like kind of like my identity, and I was super fortunate. I was really, really struggling with it, of like not having that purpose in riding anymore. And so I was lucky I found coaching when I did, to kind of like live vicariously through other people. And a lot of people I coached were beginners, they weren't racers. I've coached way more non-racers than I have racers, but their successes were still victories, So, it was a really rewarding job and gained a lot of experience traveling all over the country doing these clinics for Ninja. And then, but quickly like realized like, okay, if I want to make a career of this, I need to kind of branch out on my own. And about that same time, Sean and Nico, who ran the bike park, wanted a manager at the time. And so it's funny, they thought I had an accounting degree and so that I could do their books, but I had a finance degree, which is, quite a bit different. I took one accounting class in college and I was like, luckily I'd already been doing another company's books. And so I got the swing of it. So I told him I would do it. And then that kind of, got me even more into the downhill world.
And this is at
And
Windrock?
yeah, at Windrock. So I was
Okay.
the bike park manager over at Windrock, and that allowed me to do that job and kind of take a step back from Ninja a little bit, because Ninja was awesome, but it was a lot of traveling. When you're working to build someone else's dream, you're not working to build your dream. And so Windrock was kind of in the step of the direction to kind of help coach for myself a little more. And then eventually I had obligations to Windrock, but I was still trying to coach on the side. And it got to a point where there was a lot of conflict, scheduling conflict. And so eventually I just took a step back from Windrock and then started coaching full time.
So are you still doing anything with Ninja, or is that completely done?
That's completely done. If I had time, I'd love to do it, just because it's a lot of fun. You're working with people who, are getting new into mountain biking, or they've been riding for 50 years and want to, break their old habits. And you get to go to all these cool trail networks and things like that. And it's a great way to get a lot of experience in the coaching world. And usually when people say, how do I get started? I'm like, hey, you need to like go get certified and then go work for this company, because they have Ninja is created a lot of cool programs to help their coaches become better coaches. So it's a great way to like not only get paid but grab experience at the same time. So they have a good pathway. You'll start out as an assistant, and then after a couple clinics, if you're good enough, you can start leading clinics, and then the next step would be like an instructor trainer, where you kind of help other coaches become better. So not doing much of that anymore, just because I just don't have time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Why do you love this sport of biking, and what keeps you going?
I don't know, man. I think for me, like moving, going fast, but being in the woods, it's kind of like two birds in one stone. It's like you can go in the woods and like, desensitize, and, have that tranquility of being in the woods. But you also have that option of getting the adrenaline rush and the endorphins and things like that. And what's cool is it can be a antisocial sport, or it can be a social sport, right? I think that's what's super cool about it. It's like some days I get back from a clinic or a lesson, I put my AirPods in and turn it on noise cancellation. I don't even listen to music because I just like need to desensitize. And then some days like been raining for 3 days straight and you're depressed, and the first sunny day pops up and you're like, oh, let's go ride with all my buddies and things like that. So I think it's the diversity of it, of what you can get out of it, is what attracts me to it and has kept me in it, really. Like soccer, for instance, it's kind of a social sport, right? And so it's not quite as dynamic as cycling is, I think, as far
Yeah,
as team sports and things like that.
I do like the option of, if I need a day by myself, I can get on the bike and go by myself. Or if I'm like needing the buddies to go hang out, then I can do that as well. It is a very nice option.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where it easily could be a hobby or a lifestyle. You're either riding your bike to work if you have that option, or riding into town, and where we live now, I live in Maryville. My daughter, who's 7, we can ride our bikes on the greenway from the house to her elementary school. And just other sports, it's not like that, right? And so
Right.
it kind of can become a lifestyle. And if she never did a race, that's fine. She can always just go use her bike recreationally or for transportation, or whatever. So I think that's what makes it super unique, is just the diversity of what a bike means to you.
Yep. Did you or do you incorporate strength training into your routine? Did you back in the day? Do you do that with athletes now?
Back in the day, I did not. I didn't do much strength training. I did like core, stuff. But with our athletes now, yeah, we definitely do quite a bit of strength training in their routine for all 3 disciplines. We coach downhill, enduro, and XC, and yeah, we all 3 disciplines. Our athletes are in the gym in some form or manner.
Nice. And how many days a week is that usually on average?
It depends. A lot of it depends on their riding schedule. Some kids, they go to public school, so they can't get out on the bike quite as much as they would like to. So we can incorporate 3 days a week. I think I got one guy, he's almost 4 days a week, but he's
Okay.
alternating different sections of the body. And where some athletes, they're homeschooled and they do 20 hours on the bike if they wanted to, they're only like twice a week.
Okay. Thinking about training, what do you see as the biggest waste of time?
That's super complex. I think 2 things. One, and this I don't think is quite an issue as much anymore, but I think sometimes zone 2 can be like those long rides. I think people kind of forget like the whole point of training, right? It's to create adaptations to stress and workloads. And so if there's an athlete who goes to school or has a regular job, if they can only get on the bike 10 hours a week, I don't think maybe that like zone 2 base season is going to be right for them, right? Because once you get up to 10 hours, you're not able to increase your workload. And so you stop creating those adaptations. And we look at pro cycling Instagram and they're all out doing these huge zone 2 rides and things like that. And they're like, oh, that's what I got to be doing. And so I'm going to go do, and it's better than absolutely nothing. But, once you're week 4 of doing 10 hours on the bike at zone 2, you're not creating any gains really. And then another trend that I've kind of noticed, especially in the Instagram world, is a lot of coaches are focusing on like what I call the 10%. And so if I had an athlete that came to me and told me they only had the attention span to do one type of physical activity, what should they do to become a better cyclist? And I would say, go ride your bike. And what I think a lot of what's happening is there are coaches who specialize in weightlifting or certain types of recovery or anything like this. And they're promoting this to where it's needed to be an extremely good cyclist. And what I think is happening, what I see a lot of riders wanting to do is saying, hey, instead of going out and riding for 3 hours, I'm going to go ride for an hour and a half, and then I'm going to go do an hour and a half of this other stuff. And I'm kind of like, well, that other stuff definitely contributes to success. But with your limited schedule, should we maybe focus more on the thing you're wanting to perform well at? Or should we, go to the gym? Or should we, do some kind of other exercise? And they get these ideas from people who are trying to sell a weightlifting program or trying to sell this other type of program. And like I said, I don't think that stuff doesn't help. Don't get me wrong. It's absolutely huge benefits. But the analogy that I like to use is if we're taking a puzzle and you don't know what that puzzle looks like, the easiest way to start a puzzle is using the edge pieces, right? You put all the edge pieces around, and once you get done with those edge pieces, you know what the puzzle is. Probably not, right? And I consider all that other stuff those edge pieces. But if we take riding, which is everything but the edge pieces, yeah, it takes a little longer. But once you get it together, you have a pretty good idea what that puzzle is, even without the edge pieces. I think it's kind of prioritizing, what you're trying to get good at.
What do you feel is the most important thing to do after a hard workout or a race?
Recover. I think working with junior athletes, that's one of the hardest things to do. They get done with their short track race and they want to go and run around the course and go cheer on their teammates. And I'm like yelling at them, like, hey, go sit down, like go get the legs up, go get something to eat, replenish. And I tell people exercising is like chopping wood, right? When you chop a little bit of wood, you start, if you keep chopping, you get these blisters. But if you stop in the right spot and then take the next day off, you get callus. And the next time you chop wood, you can chop even more and things like that. But you just keep chopping away, you get blisters. And then you're not able to chop near as enough the next day. So trying to simplify these things so where these athletes can like relate to, it's like, oh, I've had a blister before, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I'm like, yeah, by you going and running around, you're creating blisters. And so we like to just do a super easy spin, cool down, and then try to get something that's, once their stomach's ready for it, something easy to get down, things like that. And then within 6 hours get a real meal in, to kind of restore everything. And everything's on absorption mode. So kind of also depends on what they want to race too. And training, if they're always doing short track and XC back to back, we'll do back to back workouts that kind of reflect that. Downhill is pretty tough because you have 2 days of practice and then a race day. And so, you got to be able to perform 3 days in a row. Enduro, if you go to EWSs that have 2 days, you have 2 days of practice, 2 days of racing. Each day is between 4 to 6 hours ride time. So a lot of these enduro racers, we get a lot of XC racers that transition over to enduro because they think it's going to be easier. I'm like, no, you need to be able to do 3-4 hour days in a row, just like you would in XC. A lot of our enduro riders are similar programs as our XC riders with a little bit of difference as we get closer to the race season. But as far as fitness goes, it's not too different.
I can see that with those long days for sure. I mean, from what I gather, you have to pedal to the start of a section, race that, and then you have to pedal to the next start of the next section, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and so at the bigger races, you have a specific time. At small races, they say just be done with everything at 3 o'clock. big races at EWS is they'll tell you, okay, you need to be at stage 1 at noon sharp. That's when you drop. If you're late, it's a 3-minute penalty. And
Oh,
so you say you get done with a stage and you flatted. Now you got to change that flat. And now instead of doing, zone 1, zone 2 to the next stage, now you're tempo or sub threshold. And then you got to drop into, several VO2 max efforts on your stage and then do it all over again. So it's super physical enduro.
yeah. Definitely sounds like it. What trail would you recommend that's a must ride that you've ridden anywhere in the world?
Mm. I haven't done a lot of stuff like in the Pacific Northwest. I know there's amazing stuff up there. I went to Sedona a couple Thanksgivings ago. That was my first time riding desert stuff, and the desert stuff never appealed to me, but I had a blast. We were in Sedona. We rode a trail Hangover, I think,
Yeah.
and it was one of the scariest things I've ever done. Like just the exposure, these rock slabs you're able to ride down. You have all this traction, and on the East Coast, once you get to a certain steepness, you really you start to slide, right? And so you kind of have to let off the brakes to keep the tires rolling. But you have so much traction over there, you can just stay so hard on the brakes, and that was so hard for my brain to like grasp. So we'd be going down these steep chutes, and I'd get to the steepest part, and I'd start to ease off the brakes, and I was like, "Oh crap, I'm going too fast." And everyone else, like all the locals, are just crawling down it. And it was just such a unique experience for me that I think everyone should go and try it. Like it's so cool, the trail that they have over there. Europe, Leger, France was super cool because like imagine going into this town and riding downtown. There's a chairlift to take you to the top of the mountain. And then all the trails just pop out between the shops and the houses and on the road. Like it's just a free for all. It's like the entire place is like just ran by mountain bikers. And
That's awesome.
um, yeah, it is wild. I remember waking up in like our Airbnb in downtown, and there was a bakery across the street, and there's like a line of people like with bikes, and they're in the line, they're in the lift line. Like it was just so bizarre to me. Europe, it's pretty cool. They like the farmers own a lot of the chairlifts instead of like resorts,
Oh,
and so you're like riding down the trail and there's like goats in the trail and the cattle in the trail. And then you got to like hop over this fence to get to the next trail. And it's just unique, just very unique. So
yeah.
definitely if you're going to go to Europe, go to like some kind of mountain bike town like that, like Leger or Schladming, Austria is another good one.
Okay. Hey, I like those ideas. I went to Sedona. I didn't do Hangover, but I did some of the other trails that you're talking, in the area. But I know what you're
Mhm.
talking about with the grip on the rock, because here I'm used to kind of the same thing. You get steep, you're just going to skid and slide, but you definitely get some grip on whatever that surface is. That rock's
Yeah.
different there.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that it was just so unique. I never found the desert appealing, but then I got out there and I was like, "Oh, this is, super beautiful and like really unique." And the town of Sedona really embraces the riding
yeah.
community, and so that makes it that much more enjoyable. And the locals were all really cool. It was a super good vibe there, and the trails are just a ton of fun. It's something for everyone. Like I took my daughters out there and we went and rode around, and then I was able to go with my friends on like harder stuff that was like really exciting.
That's cool. Is that Hangover? Is that the one that the one guy did the documentary on? He wrote it all backwards.
That I think's the whole enchilada.
Oh, that is okay. Whole
Yeah,
enchilada. Okay, yes, that's
yeah,
correct.
yeah,
All
yeah.
right,
I haven't ridden that trail, but yeah, that's a super popular one. Definitely want something I'd like to try.
there you go. Put that one on your calendar.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I need another thing on my calendar.
If you were to give advice to younger athletes that look up to you, what would it be?
Ooh, patience, patience. I think a lot of younger athletes get under this pressure of becoming a professional athlete before they turn racing age 19, and I think that they're all that pressure and that like narrowed sight keeps them from thinking about what happens after. A lot of the guys I grew up racing don't race anymore, and they had way more talent than I did and had a lot more success than I did. But it was the push to get everything done before they, weren't a junior anymore to prove themselves as one of the top athletes. And then once they turned 19, they didn't really have a direction. I know more professional athletes, and when I mean professional, they tell the IRS they're a professional athlete. I know more that started in college than I do than when they were juniors. Casey Casey Armstrong, Dakota Norton, Casey from the XC side, Dakota from the downhill side, both started kind of really gaining traction in their early 20s. And now they're both professional full-time athletes. And then you look at a lot of athletes who've had super long careers well into their 30s. So I think just being patient, you don't need to be doing 20 plus hours on the bike as a junior. You don't need to be winning every single race. You don't need to be hitting every national, right? And doing all that traveling when you could just be going and riding your bike. So yeah, patience for sure.
Let's talk about the Gravity Academy as we're talking about the youth. And can you explain what you guys do there?
We are a race focused team that covers 3 disciplines: downhill, enduro, and XC. We kind of have 3 levels to the team: a regional level, a domestic national level, and then kind of a international level. And basically what we tried to create is a pathway for a kid coming out of NICA and having a complete pathway to becoming a professional athlete. Whether they complete that path, that's not what I pitch. I don't pitch that you're going to complete this pathway, but I pitch that we have the resources to do that. So we do all in-house of race support, all the fitness side of the coaching, and the skill side of the coaching. And so we have a select regional schedule of regional races we go to. We go to all the national events, all the Pro XCTs, and all the GRTs, the gravity racing calendar. And then last year we went to several of the World Cups. And then this year we'll go to all the World Cups. Basically, we try to make it a one-stop shop. We put all of our focus into the athletes. I let them get their own sponsors. I help them get their own sponsors. The team does have one sponsor, which is SRAM RockShox. What's really unique about our relationship with them is instead of just giving us product, they actually come out with a lot of their staff. We do a big tune camp at the beginning of the year to teach the kids how to set up their suspension, how to, communicate with mechanics, and then how to, work on the product that SRAM makes, the derailleurs and forks and shocks and things like that. And then they also provide mechanics for us at national events. Just that education side is what I really like about it and what they really like about it. I think it makes it kind of a unique relationship. Like, we're in contact with them a lot. Whereas some sponsors, like I remember, you'd hear from them, in February or March, when they hand you the thing and they tell you good luck this season, and you never hear from them again, so, or they never hear from you again. We have a great mutual relationship. But anyways, so a kid can kind of come in knowing absolutely nothing about the racing world. And we get a lot of that. The parents are like, hey, we want to go to more stuff, but we don't know where to start. Like, I don't even know what a racing age is. And so that's kind of where we can pick up off. And so in December, for our, this year, 2023 team, December, we kind of had a big 2-day camp of what is fitness training? How do you do it? What does an interval look like? Why do you use heart rate? Why do you use power? What's the plus and minuses of those two things? And so some of these people are very, very green. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have a lot of racers that are super close to becoming professional athletes. They could go out and be top 15, top 10 at a pro event, and they just need that support. They don't have that support at these big races. And so we go to these races, and so all they have to focus on is being racers. They don't have to worry about, their bikes. They don't have to worry about is their water. All I do is show up. My bike's there on the trainer, ready for me to warm up. I know someone's going to be in the pit with me with spare wheels, things like that. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for anyone who wants to join. No, and we don't have an age limit either. Obviously, the market for something like that is going to be in the juniors. But we got, 35, 45-year-old athletes on our regional team, who just want to get better at racing. Instead of joining a golf club, they kind of joined us.
Man, I think that's really awesome that you're providing that path for people. That's really cool.
It's a ton of work, and I'm lucky to be surrounded by an amazing support staff. We have a total of 5 coaches, and so that allows us to keep a 6-to-1 coach to athlete ratio. We do cap how many people we allow on the team just to make sure that the quality stays there. I think sometimes, yeah, more athletes means more revenue and more funds to run the team, but I think it comes at a cost of what you're actually there to do.
That's really cool. I've always had kind of a dream to start because I help coach a mountain bike team with kids, but not all the kids have that aspiration to be at that level, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've kind of always thought it'd be cool to have a team with maybe a handful of kids that really have the desire and the work ethic to want to get better. I think that would be something cool to do, and I like what you're doing there. I think this is awesome.
Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, and echoing what you said is working with the kids with the desire is huge, man. It's that was like the tough thing starting out. Like a lot of teams, people just want people to ride with and teammates and things like that. And, they went to the races for a social aspect. But I wanted to make this kind of available for kids who are athletes who really want it, you know what I mean? Who really want to get better. And so that's been kind of a struggle of finding kids. They say they want it, but then like when it comes down to like training or, showing up on time or practicing in the rain, it's like that's when they're like, "Oh, I want this," or well, is I just here to hang out, which is fine.
Yeah.
I'm definitely not saying, no one should be there for the social aspect, but as far as this program goes, it's very tailored towards racers. I'm like, well, you have fun, don't get me wrong, but I just want to make sure everyone's getting the opportunity that, would really utilize it.
Yep. Is there a book or a video or an athlete that you would recommend young riders follow that would help them out the most? Or a YouTuber?
There's 2 athletes that kind of come to mind, 3 athletes that come to mind that I know pretty well that I always would recommend someone, especially if you're looking to be a professional athlete. The 3 are Nico Mullally, Casey Armstrong, and Dakota Norton. And those 3, they all kind of had different backgrounds and how they got into it. But the 3, what I like really about them most is they're super genuine and they're very real. Like they will tell you. I remember I went to Nico one time and I was like, "Hey, I got these kids asking me how to get sponsors," and I was like, "How'd you get your sponsors?" And he's like, "They come to me. Like if they're not coming to you, then they don't want you." And I was like, okay, like I get that, but I was like, what, in a very blunt way, he's saying just, be yourself. And Casey's the same way, she's extremely genuine. I think being around and her attitude of like, yes, let's go ride. Yes, oh, you want to do another one? Yes. You become a product of your environment. And Dakota came from a background of, he wasn't in a community. He grew up in Michigan where there wasn't a downhill scene, and he made a lot of sacrifices to put himself in a position where he was surrounded by people who he wanted to be, right? He surrounded himself by professional athletes and he made the sacrifices to get there. And so that's something that I think a lot of kids could look up to as well is like, okay, I have my set of friends, but do my set of friends support my goals, right? And so sometimes that can be super hard, especially with social pressures and things like that of an athlete. And so he was able to, push through that. And then Casey, the same thing. She's always kind of made decisions that were based off, do I want to be doing this? And what do I want? And she made those decisions while still, maintaining friendships and relationships. And Nico, brings so much experience to the table that, and his honesty with it. He's not, he's going to tell a kid like, hey, you want to get better? You just need to be riding more. We were there at the bike park on Wednesday and it was pouring rain and you weren't there. You want to be a professional athlete? Like all the professional athletes were there, but you weren't. And people need that honesty. I think sometimes, like if someone's making the same mistakes over and over again, and we're not honest with them, and saying, "Hey, like these decisions you're making are not supporting your goals you told me you want. So we need to do one of two things. We either need to change your decisions or change your goals." Those three people, when I first started this program, I reflected to them a lot. I'm like, "Hey, what would have helped you, before you became a professional athlete? If you were doing this, what would you do?" I'm super fortunate that all three of them are in this area, and were resources for myself.
Yeah, to the athlete that doesn't show up in the rain for practice, what are you going to do when race day's rainy?
Exactly, exactly. And I have a lot of kids that are borderline OCD. If something doesn't go right, it kind of throws a huge cog in the system, and I can't think of a single race where something has gone right. When I won the cyclocross race, right, my shoe came apart, right?
Right.
Being flexible and being able to go with the groove, and some of the best athletes I know are the most relaxed, right? It's pretty interesting. The sport's super interesting in the aspect of how people deal with things and still manage success. There's so many different avenues to the same destination.
Yeah, that's a good point. And for the kids or people that are listening, if you want to follow those athletes, you can find them on most any social media.
Mm-hmm.
Just type in their name and they should pop up and you can follow those people. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we check out?
I don't think so. Yeah, I feel like I've said a lot. Super happy kind of where the sport's going. I feel like Nike has done a great job of introducing a lot of kids into the sport. And now I think it's up to a lot of other people to keep them in the sport and create avenues for them to continue their racing careers and things like that. I'm super excited to see where it all goes, and I'm glad to be playing a very small part of it.
I'm glad you're playing a part of it as well.
Yeah,
Where can
thanks.
people find you on the internet if they want to connect with you? Maybe your social and maybe your website?
Easiest place is just Instagram. I've been saying for 3 years I'm going to make a website, but I've yet to do it. And so, and social media I'm horrible at it. The first year I started the team, I made 2 Instagram posts all year. But yeah, you can find us on Instagram at Gravity Academy MTB.
Perfect. So find him there. Cory, I've had a great discussion with you on the podcast today, and I'm thankful Lon recommended we get on here and talk. Maybe one day
Yeah.
I'll bump into you on the trail, and hopefully you keep improving those kids on their bikes. And I really appreciate you taking the time today to come on the podcast.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate you having me and letting me tell my story. And yeah, really surprised Lon recommended me.
This was a lot of fun. And to all the listeners, gratitude. You have just listened to Unpacking the Athlete.